We're now on Daf Yudalit and Beis, and we're looking at the Mishnah. This Mishnah is very ambiguous. I mean, we'll read it, but until we see the Gemara, we won't know what's going on. Shum kesef, what does that mean? Shum, the word shum means to evaluate. So we're going to evaluate the damage, the nezek. And the Gemara is going to say that shum kesef means that we have to evaluate it in monetary terms, meaning we're not going to say that if, let's say, my animal damages your animal, we'll just swap animals or something like that. No, we're going to evaluate the nezek in monetary terms. Then it says shava kesef. What does that mean? Again, very ambiguous. We'll see that the Gemara identifies this as karka. Bifnei bezdin, which means that the mazik doesn't have to pay until you bring edim into bezdin, v'alpi edim. And who are these edim who are testifying against the mazik? They're bnei chorin, they're not avodim. They're bnei bris, they're not goyim. And noshim b'chlal nezek. As far as the zikin is concerned, whether a woman was damaged or she damaged, she has the same status as a man. V'nizak v'mazik b'tashlumin. In other words, the mazik will pay the entire value of the nezek. I'm sorry, the mazik will not carry the entire loss of the nezek, but rather he'll split it with the nizak. And that's going to be a reference to Shartam. Gemara says, my shum kesef. Let's go through every part of the Mishnah. Omer Rav Yehuda shum zeh, meaning the shum of Bezdin, as far as evaluating the damage is concerned, lo yehel b'kesef. We only are going to value it in kesef. What's the chiddush here? So that we're going to see in the Bryce. Tanina lahad rabbanan. That which it says in the Mishnah, but it's only implicit in the Mishnah. It's not. It's only alluded to. Is explicit in the Bryce. Para sheizika talis. Vitalis sheizika para. But what happened here? The para trampled on top of the talus and destroyed the talus. Or, alternatively, just the opposite. A man left the talus in Rishus HaRabim, and the para slipped over the talus and was damaged. Now, it seems that both of these happened to the same mazik and nizak. So the mazik was the mazik, and then he became the nizak. Ein omrim teitzei apara b'talis. We could say the following, that Bezdin will take the parashe zika, and they'll give it to the nizak as payment for the talis that was nizak by the para. Kind of like a barter exchange. No, we're not going to do that, but rather we're going to evaluate the para. We're going to, in monetary kesef terms, and we're going to evaluate the talis. And likewise, we don't say talis b'para, el shaman osa b'dam. Next, the Mishnah says shava kesef. Tana Rabbanon, we learned in a brisa, shava kesef malami shein bezdin is kokin elul in a chosim sheish lamachrayis. Means that bezdin will only confiscate if need be, if there's no payment of liquid assets, they will take away the karka of the mazik. Aval im kodam hanizak v'tofs metaltal and bezdin goven lo mihem. However, if bezdin did not get an opportunity to collect from nechosim she'ein lamachrayis, I'm sorry, that bezdin will not collect from nechosim she'ein lamachrayis, but if the nizak grabbed onto metaltalin and took it, confiscated on his own from the mazik, bezdin goven lo mehen. Then bezdin will use the metaltalin to pay the chol. Omar mar shova kesem lamechein bezdin is kokel and chosim sheish amachrayus. Frekting more my mashva. Why does shova kesef indicate karka? Omar Rabba bara ula. Shova kesef means davar shova kol kesef. In other words, people are willing to pay any price the sky's the limit, even beyond its real market value for real estate. Mind you, and what does that mean? That they'll pay all the money in the world, even beyond its value. Dover she'ein lo ono. The Torah says that there's no ono in karka. And therefore, if the lokeach either overpays or underpays, then the sale is nevertheless valid. Normally, there are two dinim in ono. Let's say a metaltal. One din is bittul mekach. If the ono is more than a sixth, then the mekach is batil. And then there's another din of hachzoras hakesef. If let's say the ono is not more than a sixth, but only a sixth, then you have to return the money that you cheated. Now, what about karka? Why is there no ono on karka? So here we have a tremendous machlokas. And the issue is the following. One shita Rishonim holds that we don't know why there's no ono in karka. It's simply a gzeres hakosim in the shem karka. And the Gemara Bava Metzia Daf Tes Amud Beis derives this from psukim. I'm sorry, I correct you. But Metzia Daf Nun Vav on the base. I read it as Tes Amud Beis. And it's a prat klal, it's a klal prat uklal, and there's no karka there's no ono in karka. However, the Rashbam in Bava Basra is of the opinion that there's a logical reason why there's no ono in karka. And the reason for that is because karka ein lo mechir. There's really no set price for karka. One lokech is willing to pay so much, and another lokech is willing to pay twice that amount. So that's not called ono. Let's add another important point here about ono and karkos. The Ramban in his Perish al Torah in Parshas Bahar, and this also appears in the Shita Mekubetzes in Bava Basra. Ein ono karkos means that you don't have to return the money of the ono, you can't be mevatel mekach ono, but nevertheless there's a lav of lo sonuas amisecha that applies even to karkos. So this is a very challenging lumdus here, conceptual distinction between the Isur lav that does apply to karka as opposed to all the other monetary dinim of ono. They don't apply to karka. Now, metaltalin, as we said before, included in ono. So the Gemara now asks the following kasha: Avodim ushtaris nami ein lehem ono. There's no din of ono in avodim and shtaros. So if the lokeach overpays or underpays for an eved or for a shtar, above and beyond or much less lower than the going rate in the market, the mekach is not bottom. And yet the Brisa says that Bezdin is not gover except for Nezikin, except for Karka. Why not from Avonamu Karka and Shtaros? And therefore the Gemara rejects this interpretation of the words Shavakesef. Elama Rabba Bar Ula, what does Shavakesef mean? In other words, the kinyanim of yad, which means mashiach, agbo, etc., do not apply to karka. The only way that you can acquire karka is with kesef, but not with mashiach. The same din applies to Evid and Shtar. There's no kinyan mashiach, neither in Evid nor in Shtar. And yet the Brisa says that Shavak Kesef is only karka. So the Gemara rejects this interpretation of Rabbi Bar Ula. Ela Rav Ashi, this is the final word. What does Shavak Kesef mean, and why is it karka? Shavak Kesef elo Kesef. Meaning the phrase Shavak Kesef means it's not at all similar to Kesef. Kesef is something that you can transfer from one part of the world to the other. I can ship you money, I can, wire you and through the banks. And karka is just the opposite. There's no tiltal of karka. You can't pick up karka and relocate it. Vahani Kulu and all the others, including Avonim and Shtaros, Kesef Ninu. They are similar to Kesef because you can be metaltel from one city to the other, from one country to the other, whether it's Avodim or the Shtaros. Rami Le, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Chidin, Rav Huna Bered, Rabbi Yeshua. There seems to be a stira tana in one price that we brought earlier that interprets the Mishnah Shavah Kesef B'Lamed She'ein Business Kokin Elun Chos She'esh Lem Achrayos, meaning for Karka. But Tanya, we have another price that says Yoshiv. The pasuk says Bala Bar Yoshiv Kesef Yoshiv L'Balo and Yoshiv L'Rabos Shavah Kesef Afilu Subin. So how can you tell me that Bezdin will only collect the chov from Karka? We have a loch of Yoshiv Afilu Shavah Kesef Afilu Subin. And the Gemara answers Hachamayaskinon. What is the Mishnah and the Brisa talking about here? Biyasme. Yisomim have to pay for the Nezikin, the Nezek of their father, the late father. And Bezdin will collect from the Yisomim Karka, but not Metaltal. Because we have a principle that Metaltal shall Yisomim Eino Mishtabdin Lebalchov. But from the Mazik himself, you can collect even Metaltal, as we learned from Yosef. So this halacha in the Mishnah, namely that you can Bezdin will only collect from the Mazik, from Karka, not from Yosef Rabbi Subin, that's referring to Yisomim. Frek Gemara Ibi Yasme, if the Mishnah, the Brisa, talking about Yisomim, ain't a Sefer. What are you going to do with the bottom part of the Brisa? It says, "Im Kodam Nizak B'Tofas Metaltul in Bezdin Govelo Mehem V'Ibi Yasme Amai Bezdin Govelo Mehem." We have halacha that metaltalin of Yisomim lo mishtabdi lebalchov. So why would feast of the Nizak be meaningful? And Gemara says, "Kidomar Rava, Omar Rav Nachman." This is a Gemara in Masechet Ksubas Pei Dalet Ovid Beis, that there is a situation in which tefisa is meaningful and effective. Kegon, like in the case of shetofas mechayin, hachanami shetofas mechayin. So it means while the father was still alive, the Nizak went ahead and he was tofes metaltalin. And in such a case, even though he died subsequently, it's not considered as if we're doing a Maisa Gvir from the Yisomim. We're just allowing the Nizak to hold on to that property that he already grabbed in the lifetime of the Mazik of the father. And in this case, the Chov of Nezikin is being collected from metaltal shetofas, even from the Yisomim. The Mishnah says Bifnei Bezdin, which means that the karka from which Bezdin will collect on behalf of the Nizak from the Mazik, it's got to be in front of Bezdin. And biyad mazik, v'lo biyad zeh shekana mimenu. What happens? What if the mazik sells property? Prat lemocher nechasim. The mazik sells his property after the hezek. V'achkach holich bebezdin. Very smart guy. He says, I'm going to show up in Bezdin, and the Nizak is going to sue me for damages. I'm going to say, well, I sold all my nechasim, and go collect from the lokeach. And Bezdin cannot be goven from lokeach. That's what it means with Bezdin from the karka of the mazik. Frek the Gemara, Shmami no, should we derive from this Mishnah the conclusion that lava umocher nechos v'achkach bo lebezdin ain't bezdin goven lo mehem? That even if a person borrows money and then he sells his nechasim and he doesn't have any liquid assets or anything to collect from, that you can't collect from lekuchos, we know that the malva can have recourse to collect from lekuchos. So the Gemara therefore rejects this original pshat. Ella, what does the Mishnah have in mind? We're talking about the laws of knossos. Prat lebezdin and yotos. There are two categories of bezdin. There's the bezdin of hedyotos and there's the bezdin of mumchen. And as far as the dini knossos is concerned, we need a bezdin of mumchen. And that's what the Mishnah means, bifnei bezdin. That knossos have to be collected and can only be collected in front of a bezdin of mumchen, but not in front of a bezdin shel hedyotos. Mishnah says, Al pi edim. The Gemara says, Prat lemodu v'knas v'yachkach bo edim shu potu. A person comes into Bezdin and he confesses that his shartam was nogeach, and he has to pay a knas, which is called chatzi nezek knasa. And now he's potter. We have a principle, modu v'knas is potter, as long as there are no edim. Fact the Gemara, that makes sense. Laman the Omar, modu knas yakoch bo edim potter. That since he jumped into Bezdin with his odah before the edim got there, he remains potter even after the edim come in. How are you going to explain the Mishnah according to the opinion that says that once the edim come in, he has to pay, even though previously he was moed v'knas? And the Gemara says, you're right. According to that opinion, there's no chiddush in our Mishnah, right? Because the Mishnah says prat lemoed v'knas. That alpi aid, meaning that even if he was moed v'knas, but the edim came in, we could be machayev him, and that's just an application of the universal rule that moed v'knas yakach bo edim chayev. So what's the chiddush here in our Mishnah? Seifa tzruchle. What's in the Seifa? And here we turn to Daf Tesvavam and Aleph. B'nei chordu b'nei bris. So now we're saying that the chiddush of the Mishnah is not that he's chayav to pay based on edim, even though he made a hodah beforehand, but rather which edim are reliable. The iyashmina, we need to know there's a psul ed is called an eved, meaning an eved kanani, and a psul ed is called a god. The iyashmeinon eved. If you had only come to exclude evidence says possible yedus, then it's mishum de'en lo yichus. Maybe the reason why an eved is excluded from edus is because he's not yuchus to his avos, and basically he's considered as if he has no yuchsin at all. And a person who has no yuchsin is likely to lie and perjure himself under oath. For example, a Nachri will inherit his father in the Gemara Yevamos, because it says in a pasuk in Malachim, Ben Hadad, Ben Tivrimon, Ben Chizayon. So even Goyim have a yichus to their fathers. Emolo, maybe he has yichus. So since he has yichus, he shouldn't be possibly yedus. If he would have told me only Nachri, he should know shaykh v'mitzvah. Ever the shaykh v'mitzvah, he's chayav mitzvah like an isha, lola v'isha, emolo. I might think he's not possibly yedus. Tzricha. And this is where we're going to stop. I just want to mention that if you have any interest in trying to understand who's possibly yedus and why, especially in the case of an eved, there's a book called Reflections of the Rav, Part 1, Volume 1. It's published by Rabbi Avram Bezdin. I knew him well. And there, the Rav, in one of his public lectures, goes into great detail to try to explain the whole mentality of who we can trust in Eidus and who is not trustable in Eidus, and why the Eved is disqualified from Eidus. So, Mitzvah Hashem, tomorrow we'll pick it up here, Vanoshim, Bichlal, Hanezek, and the Gemara is going to derive that from Psuk. So thank you again, and I appreciate it. Cult.